I thought I knew my family's story until a DNA test revealed we weren't just immigrants seeking a better life. We were criminals running from the law. Growing up, I was that kid who was obsessed with family history. While my friends were playing video games or scrolling through social media, I was the one pestering my grandmother for stories about the old country. My name is Michael. I'm 28 now. I've always been the family historian, the one who remembered birthdays, organized reunions, and kept all the old photographs in carefully labeled albums. My family came from Ireland, or at least that's what we always believed. My great-great-grandfather, Patrick O'Sullivan, supposedly arrived at Ellis Island in 1892 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dream of making it in America. It was the classic immigrant success story that every American family loves to tell. Patrick worked the docks in Boston, saved every penny, and eventually brought over his wife and 3 children. They settled in a small Massachusetts town where they opened a modest grocery store that became the foundation of our family's middle-class life. My grandmother, Patrick's granddaughter, would sit me on her lap when I was little and tell me how proud I should be of our heritage. We O'Sullivans, she'd say in her fading Irish accent, were survivors. We came here with nothing and built something beautiful. Show me the one photograph we had of Patrick, a stern-looking man with intense eyes and calloused hands, standing next to what looked like a horse-drawn cart loaded with goods. The story went that Patrick was a hard-working merchant who sold household items and food to the Irish immigrant community, spoke the language, understood their needs, and became a trusted figure in the neighborhood. My family always talked about how he had this incredible work ethic, how he'd wake up before dawn and work until midnight, how he somehow always had money when other families were struggling during tough times. I ate up every detail. As I got older, I started researching genealogy websites, trying to trace our lineage back to Ireland. I'd wanted to find the exact village Patrick came from, maybe even distant relatives who still live there. I spent hours on Ancestry, scouring immigration records, ship manifests, and census data. But here's the thing, I could never quite make the pieces fit. Every document I found seemed to contradict the family stories just slightly. The dates were off, the locations didn't match, and Patrick's occupation was listed differently on various records. Sometimes he was a laborer, sometimes a merchant, sometimes just trader. I chalked it up to the inconsistent record-keeping of the time. Immigration officials probably didn't care much about getting every detail right for Irish immigrants. My obsession with family history only intensified when I got engaged to my girlfriend Emma 2 years ago. She came from one of those families that could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower, and I felt this weird pressure to match her family's pedigree. Not that she ever made me feel that way. Emma couldn't have cared less about ancestry. But I wanted to give our future children a rich sense of where they came from. That's when I decided to take a DNA test. I figured it would be the perfect engagement gift to myself. Finally, concrete proof of our Irish heritage. Maybe some distant cousins to connect with, and hopefully some answers to fill in the gaps in Patrick's story. I ordered the kit online, spit in the tube, and mailed it off with high expectations. I imagined getting results that would show 80% Irish DNA, maybe some Scottish thrown in, and perhaps a connection to some charming village in County Cork where I could plan a romantic honeymoon trip with Emma. We'd walk the streets where my ancestors once lived, visit the church where they were baptized, and I'd finally feel that deep connection to my roots that I'd been searching for my entire life. While waiting for the results, I threw myself even deeper into research. I contacted distant relatives, digitized old family photos, and even reached out to historical societies in Massachusetts and Ireland. Everyone I spoke with had nothing but good things to say about Patrick O'Sullivan. He was remembered as a generous man who helped other Irish families get established, who could somehow always find goods when stores were empty, and who had connections that seemed to extend far beyond what a simple merchant should have had. My great-aunt, Margaret, Patrick's last surviving grandchild, lived in a nursing home about an hour from my apartment. I started visiting her regularly, hoping she might remember details that my grandmother had forgotten to share. Margaret was in her 90s, but still sharp as a tack. She'd lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and had seen our family evolve from struggling immigrants to comfortable middle-class Americans. Patrick was special, she'd tell me, her eyes twinkling with what I thought was pride. He had a way of making things happen. When other families had nothing, Patrick always found a way to provide. He understood that sometimes you have to bend the rules a little to take care of the people you love. I thought she was just talking about Patrick's business savvy, his ability to find good deals and negotiate with suppliers. So looking back now, I realized Margaret was trying to prepare me for something much bigger than I could have imagined. But at the time, I was too focused on building this perfect family narrative to pay attention to the subtle warnings in her words. The DNA kit promised results in 6 to 8 weeks. Every day I checked my email obsessively, waiting for that notification that would finally give me the scientific proof of the Irish heritage that had defined my identity for 28 years. Six weeks after sending in my DNA sample, I got the email I'd been waiting for. My results were ready. I was at work when the notification popped up on my phone, and I could barely concentrate for the rest of the day. Emma and I had planned to open the results together that evening, making it into a little celebration with wine and takeout from our favorite Irish pub, because of course we had to keep the theme going. But when we logged into the website that night, the first thing that hit me was confusion, not excitement. According to my DNA results, I was only 23% Irish, 23%. That was it. The rest was a mix that made absolutely no sense based on everything I'd been told about my family history. I was 31% Italian, 28% Eastern European, primarily Polish and Czech, and 18% of what the site called broadly Southern European. Emma looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "Maybe there's been a mistake," she said gently. "These tests aren't always accurate, right?" I refreshed the page 3 times, thinking there had to be an error. But the numbers stayed the same. My entire identity as a proud Irish American was crumbling in real time. How could I be more Italian than Irish? Where did all this Eastern European DNA come from? And what did broadly Southern European even mean? The DNA matches were even more confusing. Instead of finding distant cousins in Ireland with names like Murphy and Kelly, my closest matches had names like Kowalski, Rossi, and Novak. People from families that had immigrated from completely different parts of Europe during different time periods for completely different reasons. I started reaching out to some of these DNA matches, hoping they might have information about shared ancestors. That's when things got really weird. A woman named Maria Rossi, who showed up as my third cousin, told me her family had immigrated from Sicily in the 1890s. But here's the kicker. Her great-grandfather had also been involved in some kind of import business in Boston around the same time. Patrick was supposed to be running his grocery store. My Nona always said great-grandpa Antonio worked with Irishmen, Maria wrote in her message. She called them business partners but always got quiet when us kids asked too many questions. She'd just say they helped each other out during difficult times. Another match, a guy named Tom Kowalski, whose family was from Poland, had a similar story. Great-great-grandfather had been involved in what the family vaguely described as transportation between Boston and various ports along the East Coast. Tom's family had old letters written in a mix of Polish and English that referenced the Irish connection and mentioned needing to keep things quiet for everyone's safety. I started mapping out these connections, and a disturbing pattern began to emerge. All of these families, Italian, Polish, Czech, even some Portuguese, had ancestors who were in Boston around the same time as Patrick. And all of them had family stories that were just vague enough to avoid any real details about what their ancestors actually did for work. Emma tried to be supportive, but I could see she was getting worried about how obsessed I was becoming with this mystery. I was staying up until 2 a.m. researching, sending messages to distant DNA matches, and spending my weekends driving to libraries and historical societies, looking for any mention of Patrick O'Sullivan or his business associates. That's when I found the first real clue. At the Boston Public Library, buried in a collection of old newspaper archives, I discovered a brief mention in the Boston Herald from 1895. The headline read, "Customs officials investigate smuggling ring at Boston Harbor." The article was frustratingly vague, but it mentioned a network of immigrant merchants suspected of avoiding import duties on goods from Europe. The article didn't name names, but it described the operation, Sources suggest the ring involved merchants from various immigrant communities, Irish, Italian, and Polish, who coordinated to bring goods through unofficial channels, avoiding both customs fees and official inspection. My hands were shaking as I read those words. Import duties, unofficial channels, a network of merchants from different immigrant communities. Everything I'd been told about Patrick being a successful businessman was starting to take on a very different meaning. I started researching what avoiding import duties actually meant in the 1890s. It turned out that legitimate imported goods were heavily taxed when they came through official channels like Ellis Island, but there were dozens of small, less monitored ports along the Massachusetts coast where goods could be brought in without going through customs. The profit margins on avoiding those taxes were enormous, enough to make a poor Irish immigrant into a relatively wealthy businessman very quickly. But it wasn't just about money. I learned that some of the goods being smuggled weren't just everyday household items. During the 1890s, there were strict laws about what immigrants could bring into the country. Certain foods, alcohol, even some religious items were heavily restricted or banned entirely. Immigrant communities were willing to pay premium prices for goods that connected them to their homeland, legal or not. The more I researched, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways that made my stomach churn. Patrick's unexplained wealth, his connections throughout the immigrant community, the way he could always find goods when other merchants couldn't, the vague family stories about him being a provider who bent the rules to take care of people. Emma found me at the kitchen table one morning, surrounded by printouts, old photos, and genealogy charts that looked like something from a detective movie. "Michael," she said quietly, "you need to talk to your family about this. Whatever you're discovering, they deserve to know. And maybe they can help you understand what it all means." But I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I needed to know more. I needed to understand exactly what Patrick had been involved in before I accused my beloved great-great-grandfather of being a criminal. What I didn't realize was that I was about to discover something that would make smuggling look like a minor infraction. After weeks of sleepless nights and obsessive research, I realized I needed help. The DNA results had opened a door to questions I didn't know how to answer. And the scattered clues I'd found were painting a picture I was unsure I wanted to see completed. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to piece together the mystery alone, I would get more family members tested. The plan seemed logical enough. If my DNA was showing unexpected results, maybe testing other family members would help clarify whether there had been some kind of mix-up, or if there really were family secrets that had been buried for over a century. I convinced my dad to take a test, and surprisingly, my great-aunt Margaret agreed as well. At 93, she was curious about what modern science might reveal about the family she'd grown up hearing stories about. "You know, Michael," Margaret said, when I visited her at the nursing home to drop off her test kit, "there are some family stories that were never meant for children's ears. Your grandmother, bless her soul, she wanted to protect the good memories. But maybe it's time the truth came out." That comment sent chills down my spine. Margaret had always been the most straightforward person in our family. No nonsense, no sugarcoating, just honest truth. If she was hinting that there were stories not meant for children, then whatever I was uncovering was probably just the tip of the iceberg. While we waited for their results, I decided to hire a professional genealogist. Emma thought I was going overboard, but she could see this mystery was consuming me. "If this is what you need to do to get closure, then do it," she said. "But promise me that once you have answers, you'll be able to let this go and focus on our future instead of the past." The genealogist I hired, Dr. Patricia Webb, specialized in immigration records and had worked on cases involving families who discovered unexpected things about their ancestors. During our first phone call, she listened to everything I'd discovered so far and then asked a question that stopped me cold. "Michael, have you considered that your ancestors might not have just been avoiding import duties? Based on what you're describing, the multi-ethnic network, the secrecy, the sudden wealth, the vague family stories. This sounds like it could have been something much more sophisticated than simple tax evasion." She explained that during the 1890s, Boston was a major hub not just for legitimate immigration, but for various forms of illegal trafficking. "We're not just talking about smuggling goods," she said. "There were networks involved in document forgery, helping people enter the country with false identities, and yes, even human trafficking. The immigrant communities you've identified, Irish, Italian, Polish, they were all dealing with severe discrimination and legal restrictions that made legitimate immigration extremely difficult." My stomach dropped. Human trafficking, false identities. These were the crimes of a desperate man trying to feed his family. These were organized criminal activities that destroyed lives. Dr. Webb agreed to research Patrick's records more thoroughly, and she also suggested something that made me incredibly nervous. "If you really want to understand what your ancestor was involved in, you should consider testing your DNA against databases that track descendants of people who were trafficked or who entered the country under false identities. Sometimes the truth about these networks only becomes clear when you see the full picture of who was affected." That suggestion terrified me. I'd started this journey wanting to confirm that I was descended from a hardworking Irish immigrant. Now I was being asked to consider whether I might be descended from someone who had participated in trafficking other human beings. Emma and I had several long conversations about whether to pursue this deeper investigation. "What if we find out something that changes how you see yourself forever?" she asked. "What if Patrick really was involved in terrible things? Can you live with that knowledge?" I didn't know the answer to that question, but I also knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty. The man I'd been told was my heroic great-great-grandfather might have been a criminal. And every family story I'd cherished might have been a carefully constructed lie to hide shameful truths. When my dad's DNA results came back, they confirmed that the unexpected ethnic mix wasn't a testing error. He showed similar percentages: heavy Italian and Eastern European, much less Irish than we'd expected. But his results also included something mine didn't: a note about potential matches in databases related to displaced persons and irregular immigration patterns. Margaret's results were the most shocking of all. Her DNA showed connections to families from at least 6 different countries, and she had matches with people whose ancestors had been documented as entering the country under assumed names. When I showed her the results, She just nodded slowly like she'd been expecting this moment for decades. Your great-great-grandfather Patrick wasn't just his name, she said quietly. Back then, lots of people took new names when they came to America, sometimes because their real names were too hard for Americans to pronounce, sometimes because they were running from something, and sometimes because they were helping other people run from things too. She paused, looking out the window of her nursing home room. Patrick helped people, Michael, but not always in ways that were legal. He helped families escape poverty, violence, persecution. He helped people who had no other options. But he also made money doing it, and some of the things he did. Well, let's just say the people he helped weren't always the only ones involved. That conversation with Margaret was my real turning point. I realized I wasn't just researching my family history anymore. I was investigating what might have been a criminal organization that operated for decades and affected hundreds, maybe thousands of families. Dr. Webb called me the next day with news that would change everything I thought I knew about my identity and my family's place in American history. Michael, she said, I think you need to sit down. What I've found about Patrick O'Sullivan is going to require us to have a very serious conversation. I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store when Dr. Webb called with her findings. Emma was inside picking up ingredients for dinner, and I thought this would be a quick update call, maybe some clarification about Patrick's immigration records or confirmation of what we already suspected about the smuggling operation. Instead, Dr. Webb's first words made my blood run cold. Michael Patrick O'Sullivan wasn't your great-great-grandfather's real name. His actual name was Patrick Kowalski, and he wasn't from Ireland. He was from a small village outside Krakow, Poland. He assumed the Irish identity when he arrived in Boston in 1889. 3 years earlier than your family believed, I felt like the world was tilting. Everything I'd believed about my identity, everything I'd told Emma about my heritage, every story I'd shared with friends about my proud Irish roots, it was all based on a lie that had been maintained for over 130 years. But Dr. Webb wasn't finished. Michael, there's more. Much more. And I need to prepare you because what I'm about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear. She explained that Patrick Kowalski hadn't just been a smuggler avoiding import duties. He had been part of what historians now call one of the most sophisticated human trafficking operations of the late 19th century. The network moved people, documents, and goods through a series of ports from Boston to Baltimore, helping some people escape persecution, but also exploiting others in ways that were truly horrific. The operation worked like this, Dr. Webb continued, her voice gentle but clinical. They would identify vulnerable families in Europe, people fleeing poverty, religious persecution, or violence. They'd offer to help these families immigrate to America for a fee. But once the families arrived, they discovered the fees were much higher than they'd been told, and they were essentially trapped in debt bondage until they could pay off what they owed. My hands were shaking as I listened. This wasn't just immigration fraud. This was organized exploitation of the most vulnerable people imaginable. Some families were lucky, Dr. Webb said. They worked off their debts in a few years and became legitimate citizens. But others, others were trapped for decades. Their children born in America were considered part of the debt. Entire families lived in conditions that were essentially slavery, working in factories, docks, and homes owned by the network members. I had to pull over. I was hyperventilating, and the grocery store parking lot was spinning around me. The man I'd idolized, whose photograph sat on my mantle, whose story had inspired me to work hard and value family. He had enslaved people. He had bought and sold human beings. There's more, Michael. Dr. Webb's voice was almost a whisper now. The DNA matches you've been finding. Maria Rossi, Tom Kowalski. The others, they're not just descendants of Patrick's business partners. Based on the records I've found and the DNA patterns, many of them are descendants of families that were trafficked by the network. Your ancestors didn't just work with these families, they owned them. The word owned hit me like a physical blow. I started crying right there in my car, sobbing in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Everything I thought I knew about myself was crumbling, but it was worse than that. I was unjust discovering that my family history was a lie. I was discovering that my family had built their American dream on the suffering of other families. Dr. Webb gave me time to process, then continued with the details that made everything even worse. The network operated for about 15 years, from 1889 to 1904. They were finally shut down by federal investigators, but most of the main operators, including Patrick, were never prosecuted. Yes. They had enough warning to destroy records and disappear into the general population. She paused. Michael, your family's sudden wealth, Patrick's ability to bring over his wife and children, the grocery store that became the foundation of your family's success, all of it was built on profits from human trafficking. When Emma found me in the car 20 minutes later, I was still crying. She got in the passenger seat and held me while I tried to explain what I'd learned. But how do you tell someone you love that your entire family identity is built on a foundation of enslaving other human beings? Emma listened to everything, and then she asked the question that would haunt me for months. Michael, what are you going to do with this information? That night, I called Margaret at the nursing home. It was past visiting hours, but I begged the nurse to let me speak with her. When Margaret came to the phone, I could barely get the words out. Margaret, I know the truth about Patrick, about what he really did. There was a long silence, and Margaret sighed deeply. I was wondering when this day would come. Your grandmother made me promise never to tell the children or grandchildren. She said the shame would destroy the family. You knew I was incredulous. You knew he was a human trafficker. I knew he hurt people to help his own family, Margaret said quietly. I knew the money that paid for our house, our education, our comfortable life. I knew it came from other people's suffering. I've lived with that knowledge for 70 years, Michael. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with it. After I hung up, Emma and I sat in our kitchen until 3 a.m. trying to process the implications of what I'd discovered. I was just descended from a criminal. I was descended from someone who had participated in one of the most evil systems imaginable. And every advantage my family had gained in America, every opportunity that had led to my middle-class life, had been purchased with other people's freedom. The question that kept echoing in my mind was the same one Emma had asked. What was I going to do with this information? The first person I had to confront was my father. 3 days after Dr. Webb's devastating phone call, I drove to my parents' house with a folder full of documents, DNA results, and historical records that would destroy everything Dad thought he knew about our family. I found him in his workshop, refinishing an old chest of drawers that had belonged to his grandfather, Patrick's son. Dad was so proud of that piece of furniture. He'd spent months researching the proper techniques to restore it, talking about how it represented our family's craftsmanship in connection to the old country. Dad, we need to talk about Patrick O'Sullivan, I said, setting the folder down on his workbench. He looked up from his sandpaper, smiling. Find some more stories about the old man. You know, I was thinking we should frame that photograph of him for your wedding. It would be nice to have him there in spirit. That comment almost broke me. Dad, Patrick O'Sullivan wasn't his real name. He wasn't Irish. The sandpaper stopped moving. Dad straightened up slowly, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. What are you talking about, Michael? I opened the folder and laid out everything. The DNA results, Dr. Webb's research, the immigration records showing that Patrick Kowalski had assumed a false identity, the historical documents about the trafficking network. As I talked, Dad's face went through a series of changes: confusion, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance. "This can't be right," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our family, ... We're good people, Michael. We work hard, we help others, we follow the rules. We can't be descended from criminals, Dad. It gets worse." I showed him the evidence about the human trafficking, about the families that had been enslaved, about how our family's American success story was built on other people's suffering. He sat down heavily on his workbench stool, holding the photograph of Patrick with shaking hands. "I need to call your mother," he said. "She has a right to know." When Mom got home from work that evening, we went through everything again. Her reaction was different from Dad's. Instead of denial, she got angry. "So what?" she said, her voice sharp. "That was over 100 years ago, Michael. Whatever Patrick did or didn't do, it has nothing to do with who we are now. You can't judge people from the 1890s by today's standards." "Mom, human trafficking was wrong in the 1890s too," I said. "People knew then that enslaving other people was evil." "But he was trying to survive," she insisted. "He was trying to build a life for his family. Maybe he made some bad choices, but bad choices?" I interrupted. "Mom, he enslaved families. Children were born into bondage because of what Patrick did. This wasn't about survival. This was about getting rich off other people's desperation." The conversation devolved into an argument that lasted until nearly midnight. Mom wanted to bury this information, to never speak of it again. Dad was somewhere in between, horrified by what I had discovered but unsure what we should do about it. The worst part was when Mom said, "Michael, you need to think about what this information could do to our family, to your cousins, their children. Do you want to destroy everyone's sense of identity because of something that happened before any of us were born?" That question haunted me for weeks. Did I have the right to burden my entire extended family with this knowledge? My cousins had children who were proud of their Irish heritage, who did Irish dance, and celebrated St. Patrick's Day and told their friends about their immigrant great-greats-grandfather who built the American dream from nothing. But I also couldn't stop thinking about the DNA matches I'd found. Maria Rossi, Tom Kowalski, and dozens of others whose families had been victimized by Patrick's network. They deserved to know the truth too. Some of them had been researching their own family histories, trying to understand why their ancestors had struggled so much, why they'd lived in such poverty despite working constantly. I decided to reach out to Maria Rossi directly. In a long email, I explained everything I'd discovered and asked if she wanted to share information about our connected family histories. Her response came the next day, and it was devastating. "Michael," she wrote, "thank you for finally telling me the truth. My family has been researching for decades, trying to understand why my great-great-grandmother lived in what could only be described as slavery, despite supposedly being a free immigrant. We found records showing she worked 16-hour days in a textile factory, lived in a basement with 8 other people, and sent every penny she earned to pay off a transportation debt that seemed to grow larger every year instead of smaller." Maria's email continued, "My great-great-grandmother died at 34, exhausted and broken, still owing money to people she called the Irish bosses. Her children were told they inherited her debt. My great-grandfather worked his entire life trying to pay off money that his mother supposedly owed for passage. 2. America passage that should have cost maybe $20 but somehow turned into a debt of hundreds of dollars that included interest and fees that were never explained." She ended her email with a request that made my stomach churn. "Michael, I don't blame you for your ancestors' actions, but my family deserves to know the truth about why we struggled for 3 generations to escape poverty that was artificially imposed on us. We deserve to understand that our family's suffering was because we were lazy or unlucky. It was because we were systematically exploited by people like your great-great-grandfather." That email forced me to confront the hardest question of all. What did I owe to the families that my ancestor had victimized? Was it enough to feel guilty and keep the secret, or did justice require something more? 6 months after discovering the truth about Patrick, I made a decision that changed everything. I couldn't live with keeping this secret. I couldn't live with the knowledge that families like Maria's were still searching for answers about their ancestors, suffering while I sat on information that could provide closure. Emma and I spent countless hours talking about what the right thing to do was. She worried about the impact on my family, but she also understood that staying silent felt like a continuation of the harm Patrick had caused. "Those families deserve the truth," she said one night, as we lay in bed, both of us staring at the ceiling. "And honestly, keeping this secret is eating you alive. You haven't been the same person since you found out?" She was right. The knowledge had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. Every time I looked at our comfortable apartment, I wondered if it was somehow connected to the wealth Patrick had built on others' suffering. Every time I heard someone tell a proud story about their immigrant ancestors, I felt like a fraud. I'd spent my whole life telling people about my great-great-grandfather's inspiring journey from poverty to success, never knowing that his success had come at such a terrible cost. I started by reaching out to all of my DNA matches who seemed to be connected to Patrick's network. Maria Rossi was incredibly gracious about everything, and she helped me connect with other descendants of trafficking victims. Together, we began piecing together a more complete picture of how the network had operated and how many families had been affected. What we discovered was both worse and more complex than I'd initially understood. The network had trafficked hundreds of families over its 15-year operation, but it had also legitimately helped some people escape genuine persecution in Europe. Some immigrants had paid their debts and built successful lives, while others had been trapped for generations. Patrick and his associates had been opportunistic, helping people when it was profitable, exploiting them when they were vulnerable. The hardest conversation I had to have was with my extended family. I organized a family reunion, something that hadn't happened in years, and invited everyone from my generation and older. Cousins, aunts, uncles, second cousins, everyone who had grown up with the Patrick O'Sullivan legend. I'll never forget standing in front of 37 relatives in my aunt's backyard, holding the same folder of documents that had destroyed my world 6 months earlier. Some of them had brought their children, expecting this to be a celebration of family history. Instead, I had to tell them that everything we'd believed about our identity was a lie. The reactions varied wildly. Some family members refused to believe the evidence. Others got angry at me for digging up ancient history that was better left buried. My cousin Janet accused me of trying to make the family feel guilty about things that had happened before we were born. "What do you want us to do, Michael?" she asked. "Apologize for being successful. Give away everything we've worked for." But there were also family members who surprised me with their support. My Uncle David, who'd always been the most conservative person in the family, said something that stuck with me. "If this is true, then we owe it to those other families to acknowledge what happened. We can't change the past, but we can at least stop pretending it didn't happen." That family meeting led to the most important decision I've ever made. Together with Maria Rossi and descendants of other affected families, I started a project to document the true history of Patrick's trafficking network. We're working with historians, genealogists, and local museums to create a permanent record of what happened and to honor the memory of the people who suffered. It's not about guilt or blame. Everyone involved in these crimes has been dead for decades, but it is about truth and justice. The families who were trafficked deserve to have their stories told. Their descendants deserve to understand why their ancestors struggled, why they lived in poverty despite working constantly, why they seemed to owe debts that could never be repaid. We've also established a small fund to help descendants of trafficking victims with genealogy research and education costs. It's not reparations. Nothing could truly repair the damage that was done. But it's a way of acknowledging that our family's success was built on their family's exploitation. The most surprising outcome of this entire experience has been how it's changed my relationship with Emma and my vision for our future. We got married last spring, and instead of the big Irish-themed wedding I'd originally planned, we had a small ceremony that celebrated the complexity of American immigration stories, the beautiful and the ugly, the inspiring and the shameful. Emma wore her grandmother's dress. I carried a photograph of Patrick. Not the sanitized version of his story that I'd grown up with, but the complicated truth of who he really was. A man who had fled poverty and persecution, who had tried to build a better life for his family, but who had also participated in terrible crimes against other vulnerable families. I still struggle with questions that don't have easy answers. How much responsibility do we bear for our ancestors' actions? What do we owe to the descendants of people our families harmed? How do we honor the good parts of our heritage while acknowledging the shameful parts? But I've learned something important through this process. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a beautiful lie. The Patrick O'Sullivan story was inspiring, but it wasn't real. The Patrick Kowalski story is complicated and morally ambiguous, but it's the truth. And understanding the truth about where we come from, the good and the bad, is the only way to make informed decisions about who we want to be. Now, when people ask me about my family history, I tell them the real story, not just the parts that make me feel proud, but the parts that make me feel responsible to do better. Because that's what we owe to the past and to the future. Not perfection, but honesty, and the commitment to learn from the complicated truth of who we really are.